Welcome to our debate on the existence and nature of God. We have two distinguished scholars with us, a Catholic theologian and a Buddhist theologian. They will discuss, in a modern context, whether God exists and how each tradition views ultimate reality. Topics will include classical arguments for God, Buddhist metaphysics like emptiness and dependent origination, the nature of reality, the problem of suffering, consciousness and the self, and ultimate meaning or liberation. Both will present their views and challenge the other's perspective. Let's keep the discussion sharp and intellectual, yet respectful.
Thank you. From the Catholic perspective, yes, God exists, and we have both classical and contemporary arguments to support this. Let me outline a few. Cosmological argument. First cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, as even modern science affirms with the Big Bang, so the universe must have a cause beyond itself. St. Thomas Aquinas formulated this as the unmoved mover, or first cause, an initial uncaused cause that started everything. We call this first cause God. Nothing within the universe explains its own existence fully. Ultimately, a transcendent cause is needed. 2. Contingency argument. Even if one imagines an eternal universe, everything we observe is contingent. It depends on something else for its existence, and could have been otherwise. For example, I exist because of my parents, and they because of theirs, and so on. This chain of dependency cannot regress infinitely without explanation. There must be a necessary being that has its existence by its own nature, and upon which all contingent things depend. As Aquinas put it, this is a being whose essence is existence itself. In Catholic thought, this necessary ground of all being is God. 3. Teleological argument. Design and order. The universe exhibits remarkable order and intelligibility. Natural laws, the fine-tuning of constants for life, the complex information in DNA, all this suggests not random chaos but intentional design. Classical thinkers like Aquinas used the example of an archer guiding an arrow to its target. Likewise, the order in nature points to an intelligent designer. Modern advocates too argue that the fine-tuning of the Big Bang and the rational structure of reality imply a cosmic mind behind it. As the Bible says, the heavens declare the glory of God, which we interpret as creation bearing witness to a creator. 4. Ontological and moral arguments. Philosophers like St. Anselm have even argued that by definition God as the greatest conceivable being must exist, or else we could conceive of something greater, though this argument is more abstract. Additionally, many argue from moral reality. If objective moral values and duties exist, there must be a transcendent grounding for them, an ultimate good, which is God. Without God, moral laws would be just subjective preferences or evolutionary tricks. But we sense that some things, love, justice, are truly good or evil. This points to a moral lawgiver beyond human society. In Catholicism, these arguments are reinforced by our theological sources. The Bible and Church Fathers consistently affirm God as the creator and sustainer of all things. For instance, the Gospel of John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and all things were made through him." The Church also teaches in documents like Fides et Ratio that faith and reason are complementary. Human reason can indeed arrive at knowledge of God's existence. So, combining philosophical reasoning with our tradition, the existence of God is not a blind leap, it's a conclusion supported by logical arguments, metaphysical principles, and millennia of insight.
Thank you. From the Buddhist perspective, the question of God's existence is approached very differently. Buddhism is famously non-theistic. It does not posit a creator God. And when we examine those classical arguments through a Buddhist lens, we find them unconvincing or unnecessary. Let me respond to each point and offer our viewpoint. First, the cosmological first cause argument. You claim everything that begins has a cause, and the universe must have a first cause God. Buddhism would counter with the principle of dependent origination pratitya samutpada. Everything arises due to a web of interdependent conditions, not from a single uncaused cause. If you say God is the first cause, you're essentially exempting God from the rule that everything needs a cause. But if one thing, God, can be uncaused and eternal, why not simply say the universe or the chain of events is uncaused or eternal in itself? In fact, traditional Buddhist cosmology often sees the cosmos as beginningless and cyclic. Modern cosmology, too, while it speaks of the Big Bang, leads to questions about what preceded it. Some speculate about quantum fluctuations or multiverses. There's no consensus that an external deity is required to start the universe. Your argument pushes the mystery back one step. God did it. But then the obvious question arises, what caused God? If God needs no cause being eternal, a Buddhist will ask, why insist the universe must have a cause? Perhaps existence is just a flow of conditions with no absolute beginning. So to us, invoking God as a first cause isn't an explanation. It's more like saying, and then a miracle happens. Buddhism prefers not to insert miracles when not needed. Second, on the contingency argument and the idea of a necessary being. You contend everything contingent requires a necessary being as its ground. Buddhism challenges the substance-based ontology behind that claim. We don't see existence divided into independent substances that require a fundamental substance to hold them all up. Instead, everything is empty of any independent essence. This is the doctrine of emptiness sunyata. Emptiness means that phenomena have no inherent permanent nature of their own. They exist only in dependence on other conditions. If nothing has an independent essence, then positing a single independent essence, God, at the bottom of reality contradicts that insight. It's like you observe that all phenomena are interconnected and lack self-sufficient being, which Aquinas even hints at by saying they're contingent. But then you stop short and assert there must be one thing that does have self-sufficient being. Buddhism would ask, why assume the chain of interdependence needs a single ultimate grounding entity? Perhaps reality is more like an infinite web with no first node. Nagarjuna, a great Buddhist philosopher, argued that a first cause is logically problematic, if the universe is effect and God the cause. Either God is an effect of prior causes then not first, or God is causeless, but if something can be causeless, the whole argument that everything must have a cause breaks down. Nagarjuna essentially shows that we don't need to reify a necessary being. Rather, all things, even ideas of gods, are empty of inherent existence and equal to arise from conditions. Third, your design argument. You see order and assume an orderer. A Buddhist sees order as simply the natural pattern of causes and effects. It's true the universe has law-like regularities. This is what we call dharma, the natural law or truth of how things are. But must we personify the lawmaker? The patterns in nature can emerge from chaos. Through self-organizing principles, complexity can arise via evolution without a guiding hand. Invoking an intelligent designer introduces a big anthropomorphic leap. You're projecting a human notion of a craftsman onto the cosmos. A Buddhist would caution that this might be a psychological comfort, wanting a cosmic parent figure, rather than a necessary inference. Modern science often explains apparent design by natural selection, or physical principles, without needing to hypothesize a divine engineer. And even if there were some guiding principle, why assume it's a single personal God, rather than, say, impersonal karma, or simply the way emptiness gives rise to form? Fourth, regarding moral arguments and meaning. Buddhism does acknowledge objective moral causal laws in the form of karma. Unwholesome actions lead to suffering, and wholesome actions lead to well-being, naturally. But we don't require a divine lawgiver for this. It's more like a law of nature, like gravity for ethics. As for an ultimate good, Buddhism focuses on eliminating the causes of suffering, greed, hatred, delusion, and cultivating compassion. These are universally valuable without needing to root them in a creator. You mention you sense objective morals, so there must be God. But a Buddhist might say our sense of compassion or conscience could just as well come from innate empathy and interdependence with others, not a cosmic commandment. We also find your ontological argument unpersuasive. Just because we can conceive of a greatest being doesn't mean it exists outside our mind. I can conceive of a perfect lotus that never withers, but it doesn't magically pop into existence. In Buddhist philosophy, clinging to concepts without empirical basis is a trap. Ultimate reality often transcends conceptual thinking. So an argument that relies purely on a definition of God to prove God is seen as a word game, not a proof. In summary, from the Buddhist viewpoint, there is no need to posit a personal creator God to explain the universe or to live a meaningful moral life. Everything can be explained by natural causes and conditions. The Buddha himself remained silent or agnostic on metaphysical questions like the origin of the universe or the existence of a creator, because he felt those questions do not lead to enlightenment, awakening. Instead of looking for a creator outside, Buddhism turns attention inward. How do we liberate the mind from suffering here and now? We'll later discuss how Buddhism views ultimate reality not as a being but as emptiness or nirvana. But to directly answer, does God exist? Buddhism finds no compelling evidence or logical necessity for a creator God. Instead, we see belief in a permanent creator as possibly a projection of the human ego, an attempt to find something eternal and unchanging in a world of change. Buddhism gently challenges that and offers an alternative worldview grounded in impermanence and interdependence.
I appreciate that detailed response. Let me offer some rebuttal and further clarification from the Catholic side. You raise a classic question. If everything needs a cause, who caused God? The traditional answer, which maybe I need to clarify, is that God is not in the same category as the universe. When we argue everything that begins has a cause, we mean everything in the domain of contingent, temporal things. God, by definition in classical theism, did not begin. God is eternal and uncaused. This isn't a special pleading. It's the logical conclusion of the cosmological argument. There must be something fundamentally different from the contingent universe, a necessary, uncaused reality. The Buddhist critique seems to be, why not just say the universe itself is uncaused or eternal? 2 points. 1. Modern evidence strongly suggests our universe began time-space-matter had a beginning at the Big Bang. If you say perhaps an earlier universe or multiverse existed, okay. But even an infinite regress of past universes still wouldn't explain why there is something rather than nothing, or why any universe or multiverse exists at all. 2. More importantly, an eternal universe still wouldn't be self-explanatory. Even an infinite chain of contingent events requires a sustaining ground. In Catholic thought, God is that eternal self-existent ground that keeps the chain in existence at every moment. We see the universe, and any multiverse or laws of physics, as contingent reality that is kept in being by God right now, not just started and left alone. It's like if you have an infinitely long chain hanging, that chain still needs a hook to hang from. An infinite regress with no foundation is like a chain with no hook. Conceptually, it gives no ultimate explanation. Now, you invoked dependent origination and emptiness, saying nothing has independent essence. Catholic philosophy actually can partially agree. Created things have no independent existence. They depend on other things, ultimately on God in our view. But you take it further and deny any enduring essence at all. Here is a sharp difference. Catholic metaphysics, following Aristotle and Aquinas, does affirm that things have essences or natures. A human being, a tree, etc., have a definable nature, and that ultimately these natures come from and participate in God's being. You caution that positing a single permanent being contradicts emptiness. We would counter, if indeed everything we see lacks the power to exist on its own, is empty of self-existence. Doesn't that hint that existence must come from something beyond this interdependent web? Rather than a flaw, the contingency emptiness of the world points to a non-contingent source. Think of it this way. If all phenomena are like shadows with no substance of their own, isn't it logical that there is a light casting those shadows? We of course don't think God is a thing with inherent existence in the way a finite object would claim to be. We say God is being itself, ipsum esse subsistens, as Aquinas calls God. God is not one dependent part of the web of conditions. God is the ultimate reality giving rise to the web. In a way, Catholic thought might interpret Buddhist emptiness of things as everything points beyond itself. We simply fill in, it points to God, the fullness of being. Regarding the design argument, you accused us of anthropomorphism and said natural law or evolution can produce order. Yes, evolution explains a lot about life's complexity, and physical laws explain planetary orbits, etc. But the deeper question remains, why are there such rational laws at all? Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective in describing nature? Why does the universe have an intelligible order that our minds, which you might say evolved randomly, can grasp? To a Catholic, this coherence between mind and world is not just luck. It reflects that the same Logos, divine reason that ordered the universe, also created our reasoning minds in his image. So we see design not just in complexity, but in the very intelligibility and beauty of natural law. You suggest this might be psychological comfort. Perhaps some people believe in God for comfort, true, but as an argument, pointing out apparent design isn't just emotional, it's an inference to the best explanation. You mentioned anthropomorphic cosmic craftsmen versus impersonal processes. I'd argue an intelligent cause is a better explanation than unguided processes for things like fine-tuned physical constants, which are finely balanced for complexity in life, something even atheist physicists find astonishing. And if you allow an impersonal law as the explanation, that begs the question of a lawgiver or a source for laws. Impersonal karma or dharma still leaves open, why is the moral law like this? Why does ethical cause and effect exist at all? A personal God as the author of both physical and moral order provides a coherent answer, because the Creator endowed creation with order. On morality and meaning, you say Buddhism can have ethics without God via karma. Certainly, Buddhism has a rich ethical system. But consider, if there is no enduring self and no divine justice, who ensures justice ultimately? Someone could in theory do great evil and get away with it except for karmic consequences perhaps in another life. But Buddhism does propose karmic law fills that role, essentially an impersonal moral law. Catholics would ask, what enforces karma? Is it just a brute fact of the universe? In our view, a just God underwrites the moral order and ensures a final justice in an afterlife if not now. Also, objective moral values, like the worth of compassion from our side, come from God's nature. God is love. If morality is just a natural phenomenon, some worry it could be relative or even nihilistic if one truly embraces emptiness. Some might misinterpret emptiness to mean nothing really matters. I'm not saying Buddhists are nihilistic. Clearly, Buddhism teaches compassion and responsibility, but without a personal ground for goodness. There's a philosophical debate whether good is truly real or just our convenient label for certain outcomes. You mentioned the Buddha avoided these metaphysical questions, focusing on practice. That's commendable for practical purposes, but it doesn't make the questions go away. The very existence of the world, the laws, our consciousness, these cry out for explanation. From the Catholic stance, saying we just won't answer whether there's a creator or not might avoid wrong answers, but it also avoids possibly the right answer. We believe reason can inquire into ultimate causes. In fact, Vatican I, an ecumenical council, taught that human reason can know God exists with certainty from the things that are made. So we see the pursuit of that question as important. To be fair, I acknowledge a methodological difference. Buddhism often starts from introspective insight and experience, seeing impermanence, suffering, etc., while Catholic theology often starts from looking outward at the world and using reason to go beyond it. Both are valuable. But from where I stand, the Buddhist view of a universe with no creator and no sustaining God is incomplete. It offers a description of how things change, but not why there is something rather than nothing. Nor does it offer the hope of a relationship with a loving ultimate reality. I would argue that the existence of a personal God actually complements some Buddhist insights. Yes, all finite things are impermanent, and that is exactly why clinging to finite things causes suffering. But instead of saying therefore there's nothing eternal, Catholicism says there is something eternal, God, and only by uniting with that eternal source can we find true fulfillment. In a sense, our answer to impermanence is not to accept nothingness, but to seek the eternal God who is unchanging.
Thank you for that robust rebuttal. There's a lot there, and it's fascinating to see both overlaps and stark differences. Let me address a few key points before we move on the need for a grounding or hook, your infinite chain needing a hook analogy. Buddhism would say perhaps our intuitions mislead us here. The cosmos might not require an ultimate hook or foundation in the way we think. This touches on deep ontology. You see the Buddhist view as incomplete for not answering why is there something rather than nothing. From my side, that very question presupposes there must be a reason or a purpose or an agent behind existence. Buddhism tends to see existence as a natural fact. It just is, without a why in the teleological sense. When you achieve deep insight prajna into the nature of reality, the question of why existence dissolves rather than gets an answer in the form of, because God. It's like asking what is north of the North Pole. The question might be malformed. Some Buddhist philosophers would say sunyata, emptiness, is the closest thing to an ultimate reality we acknowledge. But it's not an entity or a being. It's more like the ultimate truth that all things are interdependent processes. So perhaps there is no singular being at the foundation, but rather a groundless ground, if I may paradoxically put it. The dynamic emptiness that allows for the play of phenomena. This is admittedly a subtle notion, and may be unsatisfying if one is looking for a person like ground. You argue that the intelligibility of the universe implies a divine mind. A Buddhist might counter that our minds find the world intelligible because they evolved in that world. We have brains attuned to patterns that favored survival. There's a clear evolutionary explanation for why we find patterns and meaning. Even sometimes when none exist, we err on the side of seeing agency, which might explain why many cultures invented gods in the first place. So yes, we see mathematical elegance in physics. But that could simply be because only a stable, law-like universe can produce observers. Some would invoke the anthropic principle. We see a fine-tuned universe because only a fine-tuned universe could produce beings like us to marvel at it. That doesn't prove a designer. It might be a selection effect, or one universe among zillions where conditions happen to allow life. Regarding morality and justice, you ask who ensures justice in Buddhism if not God? Here karma is key. But let me clarify. Karma is not a conscious judge or enforcer. It's a principle that actions have consequences. Is it built into the universe? Perhaps yes, as a natural law of conscious intention and result. You might call that a brute fact, but no more brute than a theist saying it's that way because God made it so. At least karma is observable in the sense that our deeds do affect our mental states, and often our circumstances over time. And Buddhists would add, across rebirths as well. About ultimate justice, Buddhism might concede that the universe is not just in a human sense. Sometimes bad things happen to good people and vice versa due to complex causes, not simple moral balancing in one lifetime. But over the long run of samsara, unwholesome actions lead to suffering. It's not perfectly tit for tat or easily calculable by us, but it's an ethical causality. Now you worry without God, morality might be arbitrary. I'd respond that Buddhism grounds ethics in reducing suffering and cultivating compassion. These are objective in the sense that suffering is a real experience we want to avoid, and compassion reliably reduces it. There's no whim or divine decree here. Ethics is almost scientific. Does an action lead to harm or benefit? This pragmatic test makes morality quite concrete. And as you noted, Buddhism is not nihilistic about ethics at all. Emptiness doesn't mean nothing matters, it means nothing has independent existence, including our ego or our preferences, which actually fosters selflessness and concern for others, arguably strengthening ethics, not weakening it. Finally, the idea that the Buddhist worldview is missing the answer to why anything exists. Buddhism might say the question itself is born of a certain metaphysical craving, a craving for a fundamental ground or purpose. And craving is something Buddhism teaches us to examine carefully. If there is no creator, can life still be meaningful? We would say yes. Meaning comes from our actions, our mind, how we alleviate suffering and grow in wisdom. We find meaning in the journey of awakening, not from being the project of a creator. You say Catholicism's answer to impermanence is to seek something permanent, God. Buddhism's approach is to accept impermanence fully and find peace in that acceptance. We ask, might the desire for something permanent be itself a form of attachment born out of fear of loss? In our practice, we turn toward the reality of change and suffering, work with it directly, and find liberation through that, rather than appealing to an eternal refuge outside it. So, we remain unconvinced by the need for a personal creator. But let's move forward. I'm sure more will be said as we tackle other topics.
Excellent exchange on the existence of God. Now let's delve deeper into the nature of reality ontology, as each tradition sees it. The Catholic side posits a supreme being who is the ground of being, and the Buddhist side talks about emptiness and dependent origination. Let's clarify these views. How does Catholic philosophy describe ultimate reality and the nature of existence, and how do you view the Buddhist concept of emptiness?
In Catholic thought, ultimate reality is personal and is identified with God. We hold that God is being itself, the source of all that is. In philosophical terms, God is pure act, actus purus, with no potentiality or imperfection, the ultimate ground of all essences in existence. All created things are real, but their reality is contingent and participated, meaning they only exist because God gives them existence at every moment. Creation is not an illusion, it's genuinely real, and, as Genesis says, good, but it's not self-sufficient. We often use the concept of analogy of being. There is an analogy between the being of creatures and the being of God. We reflect God's being in a limited way. For example, human persons are said to be made in the image of God, meaning our capacity for reason, love and moral agency is a finite reflection of God's infinite reason, love and goodness. This underscores that reality, at its core, is personal and rational, because its source is a personal God. Now the Buddhist notion of emptiness sunyata, as I understand it, claims that everything lacks inherent existence and is impermanent. Catholicism would partially agree on impermanence of created things. Nothing created is eternal or self-existent. However, we wouldn't say things are empty of essence in the extreme sense. A tree is impermanent, yes, but it has a real nature as a tree while it exists. It's not just an illusion or mere conceptual construct. We cherish the reality of the world. Sacraments, for instance, reflect how physical reality can mediate the divine. So we don't embrace the idea that all is void or purely mind-made. I also want to point out, since God is the creator, there's a fundamental ontology of gift in Catholicism. Existence is given by God freely. Thus the world has a dependent reality, somewhat akin to your dependent origination, interestingly. But our explanation for that dependency is a sustaining God. I have heard some comparisons between Buddhist emptiness and the apophatic theology in Christianity, the idea that God is ultimately beyond all our concepts, a kind of divine nothingness, because God transcends everything. For example, Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart sometimes spoke of God as desert or void, beyond being as we understand it. However, that doesn't mean God is literally nothing, rather that God is beyond category. Perhaps Buddhist emptiness is pointing to something similar? But mainstream Catholic theology would still assert that behind the impermanence and emptiness of finite things, there is a stable ultimate reality, God. We consider God not a being among beings, but being itself, whose nature is to exist, and to be the source of all forms and essences. In short, our ontology is dual-layered, the uncreated reality God, and created reality the universe. Created reality is richly textured, full of beings, essences, purposes, and is upheld at every moment by the uncreated reality. We believe this view preserves the coherence of reality. There is an intelligible order because of God's logos, and a dependable ground, because of God's faithfulness in sustaining existence. The Buddhist view of everything as process and emptiness, to me, risks making reality incoherent or nihilistic if misunderstood, If nothing has inherent reality or purpose, why trust any knowledge or why strive for anything? I know Buddhists say that isn't the case, so I'd like to hear more on how they see ultimate reality. But from the Catholic side, we assert a personal, intelligent, and good ultimate reality as the foundation that makes the universe intelligible and life meaningful.
How does Buddhism describe the nature of reality and ultimate truth? And how would you respond to the Catholic characterization that emptiness might imply nihilism or lack of coherence?
Buddhism's take on ultimate reality is indeed very different. We often speak of two levels of truth: conventional truth and ultimate truth. Conventionally, the world is full of diverse things: people, trees, stars, and they function in causal relationships. This is where science and daily life operate. Ultimately, however, when we examine phenomena deeply, we find no independent, permanent core in them. This is the doctrine of emptiness sunyata. It means that things are empty of an intrinsic identity or separate self-being svabhava. Important clarification: emptiness is not nothingness. It's often misunderstood. Emptiness is the true nature of things, which is interdependence and impermanence. Because everything is empty of a fixed essence, everything is free to arise and change. Think of a wave on the ocean. It seems to be a distinct entity, but in reality it's just the ocean in a certain form, and soon it will dissolve back. Does the wave exist? Yes, conventionally. But does it have an independent essence apart from the ocean and conditions like wind? No. Likewise, a person exists, but only as a collection of ever-changing parts and conditions: the five skandhas: form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. No part of us is self-sufficient or permanent, not the body, not even the mind or what we call the self. This applies to all phenomena. Now, what is ultimate reality then, in Buddhism? We sometimes use the term dharma or dharmakaya in Mahayana thought, or simply nirvana. Nirvana is the unconditioned, not a thing or place, but the blowing out of the fires of greed, hatred, and ignorance. It is often described in negative terms, what it is not, because it transcends the conditioned world we know. Some have equated nirvana with emptiness realized. When one fully realizes emptiness, one is in nirvana, seeing that all things are insubstantial and letting go of all attachments and delusions. Is nirvana a kind of ultimate reality? Yes, but impersonal and beyond concept. It's not a creator, not a being that controls the universe. It's more like a state or truth of complete liberation. The Buddha was famously silent on questions like, is the universe eternal or not? Is the self identical with the body or separate? Does an enlightened person exist after death or not? Because from the perspective of enlightenment, those categories lose meaning. In a way, the highest reality in Buddhism is a reality of experience, the experience of awakening, rather than an ontological entity. Now, regarding coherence and nihilism, Buddhism is absolutely not nihilistic. We do not say nothing exists or nothing matters. We say things exist in a dependently arisen manner. It's a middle way between eternalism, believing things have fixed eternal essences, or an eternal God, etc., and nihilism, believing nothing is real or matters. Emptiness is often described as empty of inherent existence, but full of wondrous existence. Precisely because things are empty, they function, cause and effect works, healing is possible, change happens. If things had fixed essences, change or true transformation would be impossible. So emptiness actually explains how change and causality are possible. As for intelligibility, it's not that nothing can be known, rather, everything is conditionally knowable. A thought experiment: imagine reality as a dream. Buddhism often uses dream analogies. In a dream, events happen, perhaps coherently, but when you wake you realize the dream had no solid foundation. For Buddhists, ordinary reality is somewhat like that. Not to say it's literally unreal, but its mode of existence is more ephemeral and mind-influenced than we assume. This view encourages non-attachment, which is key to liberation from suffering. The Catholic friend worries that without a permanent ground, we can't trust knowledge or meaning. However, Buddhists trust the law of dharma, that is the consistent patterns of reality, physical and moral, that can be observed and tested. We trust in the continuity of cause and effect. We just don't assert there's a single eternal being making it so, it just is so, as part of the mystery of existence. And we do have an ultimate point of reference, nirvana, the cessation of ignorance, which is a kind of ultimate peace. It's just not a creator God or a being in the Western sense. One might say Buddhist ontology is relational, nothing stands alone, everything is what it is by virtue of its relations. Even the notion of God could be seen as a conceptual construct arising from certain psychological and cultural conditions. People yearn for an ultimate protector or source. Buddhism doesn't vilify people for that. It understands the emotional appeal, but ultimately sees it as a product of mind rather than an independent reality. To sum up, reality for Buddhism is like a vast network of interbeing. There's no center, No up or down absolutely, no beginning or end absolutely. The only constant is change and the possibility of awakening through insight into this truth. We find that coherent in its own way. It's a different kind of coherence, not a story with a single author, but an endlessly unfolding tapestry with patterns. Our goal is to see the tapestry for what it is without imposing an imagined author onto it. And one more note, you mentioned some Christian mystics speaking almost in Buddhist terms. I'd agree there's a striking convergence in some mystical language. Buddhism simply goes further to say even God, as a concept of an ultimate person, is empty. Not to be disrespectful, but meaning it's also a concept that arises from conditions, fear, wonder, etc. We prefer to engage directly with reality through meditation and ethics, rather than devotion to an unseen deity. It's a difference in approach to ultimate truth, personal versus impersonal, being versus emptiness.
Very insightful. Now, a topic that often arises in these discussions, the problem of suffering and evil. This is a central concern in both traditions, but their explanations differ. Buddhism begins with acknowledging suffering dukkha and offers a path to end it. How does Buddhism view the existence of suffering in the world, especially in contrast to the idea of an all-powerful, all-good God? Is the presence of suffering a problem for the Buddhist worldview in the way it's seen as a problem for the theistic worldview?
The problem of suffering is indeed the starting point of Buddhism. It's the first noble truth. Life as ordinarily lived is full of dukkha, which means suffering, unsatisfactoriness, stress. Buddhism doesn't just see suffering as a problem to solve intellectually. It's the fundamental existential issue we must address through practice. In Buddhism, suffering is not the result of a single cosmic event like original sin, nor the punishment or will of a deity. Instead, suffering arises from causes, namely craving tanha, ignorance, avidya, and hatred. This is the second noble truth. There are identifiable causes for suffering. The third noble truth teaches that eliminating those causes through nirvana eliminates suffering. And the fourth noble truth prescribes the eightfold path as the way to achieve that. So how do we view the existence of suffering in the cosmos? It's just part of the natural fabric of samsara, the cycle of birth and death. All beings, wandering through countless rebirths, experience suffering due to their own actions, karma, and mental afflictions. We do not assume the universe was made for suffering, or that suffering is a punishment from a creator. It's simply the natural consequence of ignorance and attachment playing out. Now, in contrast, the theistic worldview, especially Christianity, posits an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. So the obvious question arises, why would such a God allow immense suffering, from natural disasters to diseases, to the moral evils humans commit? This is the classic problem of evil. If God can prevent suffering and truly loves creatures, why doesn't he? From the Buddhist side, this problem is often one of the strongest objections to the existence of a personal God. It seems incoherent to have an all-powerful, all-loving deity, and yet a world so full of misery, often undeserved. Some Buddhist thinkers historically pointed out, either God is unwilling to stop suffering, then not all-loving, or unable, then not all-powerful, or unaware, then not omniscient. The Catholic theologian might have explanations. I'm sure we'll hear those soon about free will or mysterious plan or so on. But many Buddhists find those explanations unsatisfying or even unjust, especially when looking at natural suffering that isn't a result of human free will, like a child dying of cancer or a whole town wiped out by a tsunami. For Buddhism, suffering just is. It's a fact to be dealt with, not a theological paradox. There's a certain straightforwardness. Life contains suffering, and here's how to alleviate it. We don't have to reconcile it with an all-powerful creator's goodness. Instead, we focus on personal responsibility and understanding. How am I contributing to my own suffering? How can I alleviate the suffering of others and myself? Another angle, Buddhism emphasizes compassion, karuna, precisely because the world is full of suffering, and there is no omnipotent savior to fix it for us. No one saves us but ourselves, as a famous Buddhist verse goes. This might sound stark, but it also empowers us. We must do the work to relieve suffering. This ties into why Buddhism is sometimes called a very practical philosophy. It sidesteps the debate of why evil exists in an absolute sense and moves to suffering exists. Now let's end it. One could turn the question around. For Buddhism, is the existence of goodness a problem? Since we often focus on suffering, someone might ask, why is there joy or virtue at all if beings are supposedly driven by craving and ignorance? Buddhism answers that there are also causes for happiness, generosity, love, wisdom. And ultimately, Buddhism believes in the potential for enlightenment in every being. In Mahayana, this is sometimes called Buddha, nature. So there is a positive side. Every mind can potentially be free and luminous once freed from defilements. That innate potential might parallel a theist's idea of a soul destined for communion with God, but we frame it as an impersonal potential for awakening. So, in summary, suffering and evil are acknowledged as pervasive in samsaric existence due to natural and moral causes, karma, ignorance, etc. This presence of suffering is not a logical problem for Buddhism because we don't assert a perfectly benevolent, omnipotent creator who set things up. It's just the condition we find ourselves in, and the focus is on remedy the Dharma, rather than on reconciling it with an all-perfect being. In fact, I would challenge the Catholic perspective. How do you reconcile a loving God with the sheer scale of suffering in the world? And is saying it will all be made right in heaven, or it's due to free will, truly adequate, especially for natural catastrophes or suffering of innocents who seemingly didn't choose it?
The Buddhist theologian has posed the classic challenge to theism. If God exists and is good, why so much suffering and evil? How does Catholic theology address the problem of evil and suffering?
The problem of evil is indeed one of the hardest questions for any theist, and it's something we wrestle with sincerely. Let me outline the Catholic response as clearly as I can. Firstly, we distinguish between moral evil, suffering caused by free agents, like human cruelty, and natural evil, suffering from disease, disasters, etc. The explanations or theodicies might differ somewhat for each. For moral evil, Catholic teaching typically points to free will. God created beings, angels and humans, with free will out of love, because genuine love and goodness in creatures must be freely chosen, not programmed. The downside is that free will allows the possibility of choosing evil. When humans commit evil acts, violence, oppression, etc., that is an abuse of the gift of freedom. God doesn't forcefully intervene to stop every bad choice that would override free will and turn humans into puppets. Instead, he permits freedom, even though it can be misused, and then he works to bring good even out of the evil. A classic example, the crucifixion of Christ was an evil act by those who killed an innocent man. Yet Christians believe God turned that event into the source of salvation for humanity, a great good. This doesn't justify evil, but shows God can redeem suffering. For natural evil, this is trickier. Why would a good God design a world with earthquakes, viruses, and so on? Christian tradition offers a few approaches. One is that what we call natural evil is often a byproduct of the laws of nature, which are overall good. Plate tectonics create land and diverse environments, but also earthquakes. Viruses can be part of ecosystems, but some harm us, etc. Some theologians, especially since we understand evolution, say that pain and death in nature might be the cost of a dynamic, life-developing world, in which higher sentient life could emerge. There's also the idea of the fall, that original sin, a primordial misuse of freedom by the first humans, disturbed the original harmony of creation, and thus suffering and death entered human experience in a more acute way. How literally one takes Adam and Eve aside, the theological point is that evil was not God's original intention, but a result of creatures turning away from him, which had cosmic repercussions. Now, you asked if saying it will be made right in heaven is adequate. I wouldn't use that as a cop-out, but eschatology, the theology of the end fulfillment, is important. Catholicism, indeed, believes that God will ultimately wipe away every tear and correct every injustice, if not in this life, then in the life to come. This hope in an afterlife of perfect justice and joy is central. It means that the story isn't over yet, and current sufferings are not the final word. A Buddhist might retort that this is just postponing the answer. But for a believer, it's a trust that God's justice and mercy will ultimately triumph, even if presently we see through a glass darkly. Crucially, Catholicism also posits that God himself entered into suffering. In Jesus Christ, God became human and experienced thirst, pain, grief, and a brutal death on the cross. This is hugely significant for us. God is not aloof from our suffering. He literally shares in it, and thereby sanctifies it. The cross is a paradox. Out of this greatest evil, the murder of God incarnate, comes the greatest good, redemption. This doesn't solve the intellectual puzzle entirely, but it tells believers that God is with us in our pain, not standing above it saying too bad. Now, comparing to the Buddhist worldview, you said for Buddhism suffering just is, and must be dealt with. In Christianity, suffering is something that should not ultimately be. It's a distortion of how things ought to be. We look forward to a renewed creation, a kind of nirvana-like state perhaps, but involving union with God, where suffering is no more. So, we share the goal of ending suffering, but by transformation of the world through God's grace, not just escape from the world. A Buddhist might argue the scale of suffering, e.g., animals eating each other, children with cancer, seems an extreme price for free will, or a good dynamic world. There is a mystery here, no denying it. This is why it's called a problem. Catholic theology doesn't claim to have a neat formula that satisfies every emotional doubt. We call it a mystery of iniquity that evil is permitted. But we trust in God's goodness nonetheless. partly because we have experiences of grace, love, and meaning that point to a deeper reality beyond the pain. One might add, some Christian thinkers view this world almost as a soul-making place. John Hick used that term. Challenges and suffering can lead to growth. Virtues like courage and compassion arise in response to suffering. If God created a world with zero possibility of suffering, it would also lack many of the greatest human virtues. That doesn't fully justify severe suffering, but it's a perspective. Suffering can have a meaning or purpose in contributing to the drama of growth and redemption. I believe C.S. Lewis said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts in our pains. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world, implying sometimes suffering jolts us into seeking deeper answers. Indeed, the Buddha himself started his quest after confronting sickness, old age, and death. To the Buddhist perspective that no one saves us but ourselves, Catholics would respond that we do need help. Humans alone clearly struggle to overcome suffering. We still have war, greed, etc. Christianity offers the idea that divine help grace is available. It's not a one-sided rescue. Catholicism also emphasizes our cooperation through good works, virtue, etc., but we aren't alone in the fight. There's a loving God assisting, giving strength, and ultimately ensuring evil doesn't win. In summary, the Catholic view is, God allows suffering for now, due to a greater plan involving free will, love, and growth. And he even uses suffering to bring about good, and participate in our pain. Ultimately, all unjust suffering will be redeemed and healed. This is a hopeful outlook. The coherence comes from trusting God's wisdom. Like a child might not understand a doctor's painful treatment is ultimately for healing. I admit this may not convince a skeptic or Buddhist, but it's how we confront the reality of evil, while still affirming a good, powerful God.
If I may briefly respond to that, I appreciate the sincerity of the theistic explanation. But indeed, from an outside perspective, saying mystery and just trust it will make sense later can be emotionally unsatisfying and even seen as a coping mechanism. Buddhism's approach might seem cold or no divine hand to hold, but it's in a way more straightforward. Suffering is a problem, solve it directly. Don't posit an all-powerful being who for some reason wills or permits the very thing we're trying to solve. I also note a fundamental divergence. For you, existence creation is fundamentally good, and suffering is a wrong to be corrected. For Buddhism, existence as we know it, samsara, is permeated by suffering and ultimately unsatisfactory. So the aim is to leave samsara, achieve nirvana. Some have said Buddhism is more pessimistic about the world, but optimistic about what individuals can achieve through enlightenment, while Christianity is more optimistic about the world as God's good creation, and ultimately believes in a redeemed world, a new heaven and new earth. So we kind of invert each other in outlook toward the world. Anyway, we might return to aspects of this later, but I'm happy to move on as needed.
Thank you both. Let's address another important issue: consciousness and the self. The Catholic tradition holds that each human has a soul, an enduring self that can have eternal life. Buddhism famously teaches anatta, or no self. How do these views square with each other? And what about modern insights from neuroscience and philosophy of mind? What is the Catholic understanding of the soul and self? How do you view consciousness, and do modern findings, brain science, etc., affect your view? Also, what do you make of the Buddhist claim that there is no permanent self?
The Catholic understanding is that each human being is a unity of body and soul. The soul in our tradition is the spiritual principle of the person, the seat of consciousness, intellect, will, and the core of our personal identity. It's not a thing floating in the body, but it is the form of the body in Aristotelian Thomistic terms, meaning it is what makes a living human organism a unified person with rational capacity. We do believe the soul is immortal, so when the body dies, the soul can survive, and ultimately, be reunited with a resurrected body. We don't envision the soul as meant to be separate forever, hence the doctrine of resurrection of the body in the end. Consciousness from a Catholic perspective is not an illusion nor strictly an emergent property of matter. We see mind and consciousness as having a spiritual dimension. The brain is certainly involved. We fully acknowledge neuroscience shows correlations of brain activity with thought, emotion, etc. The brain is like an instrument the soul uses. Damage to the brain can affect personality or consciousness, just as damage to a radio affects the music coming through. But the soul remains the underlying source of one's personal identity. Modern science hasn't provided any evidence that conclusively disproves the existence of a soul. It has given us mechanism for mental processes. But the hard problem of consciousness remains. Why do we have subjective experience at all? Material processes alone, as some philosophers argue, don't inevitably produce a first-person perspective or qualia. A Catholic, and many other theists or dualists would say consciousness points to a reality beyond the purely material, a soul, or at least an immaterial aspect of mind. Additionally, we often point to rationality and free will as indicators of the soul. If humans were purely material, every thought and action would be determined by neurochemistry and physics. It's hard to see how free rational deliberation, where we choose to follow reason against impulses, say, fits in a purely physical picture. The soul provides a metaphysical grounding for genuine free will and rationality, elevating us beyond just mechanistic causality. Now, the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, no self, is radically opposed to the idea of an immortal soul. Buddhists say what we call a self is just a bundle of processes, the five aggregates, and there's no fixed eternal essence. From a Catholic view, this raises many questions. If there's no self, who is experiencing consciousness right now? Who is making decisions or accumulating karma? If, as Buddhism asserts, ultimately the self is an illusion, then enlightenment would mean realizing I never existed. But if I don't exist, how can I strive for enlightenment? There's a paradox there. Catholicism values the individual person. We see persons as real, unique, and unrepeatable. God is personal and relates to us as persons. If the self is illusory, does love even make sense? When I love someone in Buddhism, ultimately I'm loving a collection of aggregates with no core? Buddhism would answer love becomes universal compassion, not attached to a fixed identity. But from our perspective, love is between real persons, and finds fulfillment ultimately in a personal relationship with God as well. As for neuroscience, interestingly, some findings might challenge a naive idea of a simple unified self. For instance, experiments show the brain making decisions fractions of a second before we consciously are aware of them. Libet's experiments, or cases where split brain patients seem to have two consciousnesses in one body. Buddhists might seize on those to say, see no single self. However, Catholic philosophy can accommodate a lot of complexity in how the soul and body interact. The soul isn't a tiny homunculus in the brain making every little decision. It's more like the overarching form that gives unity to the various processes. Even if the brain has modules, or even semi-independent circuits, there's still one person who synthesizes experience, unless pathology like split brain temporarily divides it. For us, that unifying principle is the soul. One might also bring up near-death experiences, indies, and such phenomena, which some interpret as evidence of consciousness separating from the body. People reporting verifiable details while clinically dead, etc. These are controversial, but if taken at face value, they support the idea that mind is not completely dependent on the brain, which aligns with a soul concept. I'm not saying this is proof, but it's suggestive. Finally, the Catholic view of the self and soul ties into ethics and dignity. We see every human as having inherent dignity, because they are a soul loved by God, made in His image. This grounds ideas of human rights. Each person is valuable, not an impermanent illusion. Even after death, that person is somewhere in an intermediate state awaiting resurrection. In our doctrine, we see life as a coherent narrative of a self that continues. I would challenge the Buddhist position. If the self is just a flux, how do concepts like moral responsibility, continuity of personhood, or even the very idea of liberation hold up? Who gets liberated if there's no one there? If the answer is that it's just a process that ends, that sounds to many theists like saying the goal is basically to extinguish the self, which some interpret as nihilistic. Though I know Buddhists reject that interpretation. We think God's plan is not to extinguish persons, but to perfect them. So to sum up, Catholicism affirms a real, enduring self-soul for each person. Consciousness is a spiritual reality, not reducible to matter, and modern evidence, while showing how closely tied mind is to brain, hasn't eliminated the plausibility of an immaterial soul. The Buddhist no-self doctrine is intriguing and might yield psychological insight like not clinging to ego, but we would argue it denies an essential truth of the human person.
Buddhism denies a permanent self. How would you respond to the Catholic's points about personal identity, love, and moral responsibility? And do you find support for anatta in modern science or philosophy?
The anatta no-self doctrine is indeed one of the most distinctive and sometimes hardest to grasp aspects of Buddhism, especially for those coming from a worldview that cherishes an eternal soul. Let me clarify and respond. First, what exactly we mean by no self? Buddhism does not deny the conventional self. Conventionally, there is a person, John or Maria, with memories, personality, and so on. But what we deny is that there is an unchanging, independent essence at the core of a person, like an immortal soul or Atman. Instead, a person is a continuity of processes. The Buddha described life as a stream. There's continuity, but no single, unchanging identity flowing from moment to moment. So when you ask, if there's no self, who experiences and acts? The answer is, experience is happening, actions are happening, but they are not owned by a static self. They are results of conditions. For practical purposes, we say I or you. But these are designations on a flowing process. Think of a candle flame that burns through the night. At 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., we call it the same flame. But actually, the flame is constantly new, with new particles of wax and oxygen combusting every moment. It's a process with continuity but no fixed core. Similarly, you now are not exactly the same entity as you 10 years ago. Your body's cells largely replaced, your mind with different memories, yet there's continuity of cause, effect linking the two. From the Buddhist view, personal identity is a useful fiction. It's useful for moral responsibility. Buddhism absolutely believes in moral responsibility via karma. Even if there's no fixed self, the causal continuum means that unwholesome deeds will bring suffering to this continuum later, and wholesome deeds bring benefit. It's like how we hold a wave responsible for eroding a shoreline over time, even though the water molecules in it keep changing. Maybe not the best analogy, but you get the idea of a process being treated as an agent. Now, love and compassion, you asked? Can love make sense if there is no real self to love? Buddhism would say love makes more sense when you realize the person and yourself are not fixed entities. Why? Because then you can love without attachment. One common misunderstanding is that no, self would make one cold or indifferent. But enlightened beings in Buddhism, like bodhisattvas, are described as overflowing with compassion for all beings. They love others not as separate permanent egos, but as interconnected streams all equally deserving of kindness. In fact, the illusion of self can make love possessive, my loved one, or conditional. The wisdom of emptiness can purify love into universal compassion. So in practice, Buddhists still love their children, friends, etc. They just try to remember those loved ones are impermanent and not cling selfishly. Because clinging causes suffering. Moral responsibility, you might be surprised, but Buddhism can be quite strict about ethics and responsibility. Karma means you absolutely face consequences for your actions, whether or not a self orchestrates it. Just like if you plant a seed, a plant will grow. There's no self in the seed, it's just a process, but there's a dependable outcome. Similarly, an intention which arises in the mind stream leads to results down the line in that same stream, perhaps in another life, which is essentially a continuation of the stream. So the continuity of consciousness, not an identical soul, but a causal continuum, is what carries karma. We sometimes use the analogy of one candle lighting another to describe rebirth. The flame from candle 1 causes candle 2 feet's flame. But there's no single entity that traveled from one to the other, just a causal influence. So the person who is reborn is neither entirely the same since there's no permanent self nor entirely different since the causal flow continues. That resolves the question, who gets enlightened if no self? It's the stream of aggregates that is now free from ignorance. We can still refer to an enlightened person, but they would no longer identify a personal ego. Modern science does provide some interesting support for aspects of anatta. You've mentioned a few split brain cases showing the mind can divide, suggesting the unity of self is dependent on brain connectivity. There are cases of multiple personality where one body seems to host distinct identities. There are also everyday observations. Our personality changes over time. Even our memories, which are key to identity, are often unreliable or false. Psychologically, the sense of a single enduring ego is seen by many cognitive scientists as a kind of construct the brain generates, a narrative center of gravity. Some, like Daniel Dennett, speak this way. Though Dennett is an atheist philosopher, not Buddhist, but agrees the self is a construct. Neuroscience shows no single point in the brain where the self sits, its distributed activity. This aligns with Buddhism's claim that what we call self is an emergent property of many parts working together, the aggregates. Even in philosophy, David Hume famously said he never caught himself without a perception only bundles of perceptions. No core self. This is basically anatta in Western philosophy. Contemporary philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity and connectedness, which can even branch or diminish, and the strict identity is not a deep fact. Many who read Parfit note the similarity to Buddhist thought. So, while not proven, the idea that the self is not a metaphysically simple, immutable thing is quite well supported by evidence. It doesn't mean you don't exist right now, it just means you are a process, not an immortal soul. Regarding the soul giving higher dignity or free will, Buddhists would counter that one can have free will without an unchanging soul. Free will could itself be an emergent phenomenon of complex brain-mind interplay. Or one could say because there's randomness or quantum indeterminacy, not everything is predetermined. Or we accept that some aspects of mind are non-deterministic, without attributing them to a separate substance called soul. Honestly, the exact mechanism of free will is mysterious in any worldview. Theists just attribute it to soul, materialist to some brain process or emergent property. Buddhists might say each moment of choice arises with various influences, but there is the possibility of making a conscious choice, especially as one trains the mind through meditation to be less reactive. Finally, about what happens to the self in enlightenment, you phrased it as extinguishing the self versus perfecting the self. The term nirvana literally means extinguishing, but it's extinguishing the fires of attachment, not the person. When a person attains nirvana, what is extinguished is the illusion of the ego and all craving. The person still functions, they can still talk, teach like the Buddha after his enlightenment. They just operate without the sense of me, mine. Some describe it as the person becomes a conduit for compassion and wisdom without egoistic filters. After death, a fully enlightened being is said not to be reborn because the causes for rebirth, craving, and ignorance are gone. Does that mean they no longer exist? In a mundane sense, yes, they don't come back as an individual. Buddhism usually says that question of an enlightened being after death is unanswerable. Neither exists nor not exists, etc., because our concepts fail here. It sounds like annihilation to outsiders, but from the inside perspective of enlightenment, it's not seen as a loss. It's like a drop merging back into the ocean. If your sense of self expands to identify with all of reality and compassion, the ending of the individual self isn't a tragedy. It's a release into something far greater. Though not a super self either, just the suchness of reality. Comparatively, the Catholic view cherishes individual souls eternally. Buddhism is okay with the individual dissolving, because individuality is seen as a temporary aggregation anyway. This is a profound divergence in what we consider liberation. Neither view probably will prove the other wrong with science, since it's partly about how you interpret the data and what you value personal existence versus no self. But it's certainly an area where dialogue is rich.
If I may interject one quick thought, the Buddhist description of enlightenment as losing the sense of me, mine, and yet functioning compassionately. Interestingly, Catholic mystics talk about losing oneself in God, or dying to self to live in Christ. There is a concept of self-transcendence in our tradition too. But crucially, it's about shedding the egoistic, sinful self to find one's true self in communion with God. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, said Jesus. So ironically, both traditions see egoic selfishness as a problem. But we would say the answer is not that there's no soul, but that the soul's true fulfillment is in surrender to God's love. Then the person is not gone, but fully alive with a new center, God. It's a fascinating parallel and contrast. Buddhism seeks a selfless compassion by realizing emptiness. Catholicism seeks selfless love by union with God.
That is a fascinating parallel. The difference is subtle but significant. In one, the self is ultimately illusory. In the other, the self is real but meant to be subordinate to the divine. Perhaps psychologically the experience might even have similarities in advanced saints versus bodhisattvas, but doctrinally, yes, it's a key difference.
Thank you both. Our final major topic, ultimate meaning and salvation liberation. In other words, given your worldviews, what is the ultimate goal or purpose of life? What gives life meaning? How do concepts like salvation in Christianity or liberation in Buddhism compare? According to Catholicism, what is the ultimate purpose of human life and destiny of the soul? How does belief in a personal God shape meaning and fulfillment?
In Catholic Christianity, the ultimate purpose of life is union with God in love. We often say the goal of human life is to know, love, and serve God in this life, and to be happy with Him forever in the next. This union with God is called the beatific vision in classic theology, an eternal direct experience of God's presence, which is the fulfillment of all our deepest longings for truth, goodness, beauty, love. This is what we mean by salvation, or being saved, being delivered from sin and its consequences, healed of our imperfections, and brought into the fullness of life with God. It's not just about a change of location going to heaven versus hell, it's about transformation of the person becoming wholly like Christ by God's grace, and entering into God's family as His beloved children. We believe this was made possible through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who, from our view, opened the path to heaven for us. How does a personal God shape meaning? Fundamentally, it means meaning is built into reality. Creation has a purpose because God created it intentionally. Human lives have objective value because God values us. Morality has weight because it aligns us with God's will, which is for our good. Every person's story is meaningful because it's part of a larger story authored by God. A story where ultimately good triumphs, justice is done, and love reigns. For a Christian, even suffering and trials can have meaning as part of that personal relationship. For example, carrying one's cross in union with Christ. There's always hope, because we trust in a loving providence guiding things. And death is not the end. It's a doorway to a more complete life. This gives a profound hope and meaning that sustains people. Now, contrasting with Buddhism, Buddhism offers liberation nirvana as the highest goal, which is cessation of suffering and cyclic existence. Some might say from the outside, that sounds like the goal is to just cease existing, or to end the game. A Catholic would see our goal not as escape from existence, but the perfection of existence, eternal life in communion. We seek an ultimate relationship, whereas Buddhism seeks an ultimate release. In Christianity, love is ultimately between persons loving each other and God loving us. In Buddhism, compassion is key, but the ultimate state is often described in very impersonal terms. Peace, freedom, but not communion with a loving God, since there's no God in the picture. I think ultimate meaning in Catholicism is very much tied to love. God is love, says the New Testament, and we believe we are invited into that divine love. This is a positive vision. It's not just ending suffering, it's entering blissful positive joy and communion. Saints have moments of ecstasy in prayer that they describe as a foretaste of that union, an overwhelming love. Also, Catholicism and Christianity in general cares about the fate of the world. We believe in the resurrection of the body and a new heavens and new earth. So the material world is not just something to escape, it will be transformed. There's an aspect of ultimate meaning that is communal and cosmic. We're not just individual souls achieving salvation separately. Ideally, we are part of a community, the Church, and ultimately, all of creation is renewed. This might resonate a bit with the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of the Bodhisattva who postpones personal nirvana to help all beings attain liberation. Christianity similarly values charity and working for the salvation of others, not just oneself, and envisions a communal fulfillment, the communion of saints. To summarize, in the Catholic worldview, life has a God-given purpose to share in God's life and love. Salvation is about redemption and entering into eternal loving relationship with God and each other, where every tear is wiped away. It's the fulfillment of all truth, goodness, and beauty we seek. As St. Augustine famously wrote addressing God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That captures our perspective. Only in God do we find ultimate rest and meaning.
How does Buddhism define the ultimate goal and meaning of life? Can life be meaningful without a creator or divine plan? And what is nirvana really like according to Buddhism, in comparison to the heaven or union with God that the Catholic described?
Buddhism defines the ultimate goal as liberation from suffering and cyclic existence, samsara, in a word, nirvana. The question of meaning is very interesting, because Buddhism does not talk in terms of cosmic purpose given by a creator, yet it provides a profound sense of purpose: to awaken, to help others awaken, to alleviate suffering wherever possible. Is life meaningful without a divine plan? I would argue yes. Meaning in Buddhism is something we create and discover through our actions and understanding. We don't see life as a script written by God, rather it's more like an open field where meaning is cultivated through compassion, wisdom, and mindful living. There may not be an ultimate story, but there's a path, a dharma, that gives direction and fulfillment. One could say Buddhism finds meaning in the journey of transformation. A raw, ignorant being can through effort become an enlightened, compassionate Buddha. That's a tremendously hopeful trajectory. And even if the universe isn't created for a reason, each being can give their life a noble purpose by following the Dharma and benefiting others. Now, nirvana, it's often described in negative terms: the absence of craving, the cessation of suffering, the unborn, the deathless, etc., because it is beyond what we can fully conceptualize. But I want to emphasize, for someone who attains it, nirvana is described as supreme bliss and peace. It's not a mere void of nothing, it's more like an unshakable freedom and peace. Imagine the deepest contentment and serenity, completely independent of external conditions. That gives a hint. However, it's true, nirvana is not described as a place where you go and meet a personal God or anything like that. It's more an experience or state of perfect peace and wisdom. Early scriptures say an enlightened person is deep, immeasurable, unfathomable like the ocean. They have no more unrest, no more dissatisfaction. You compared nirvana to Christian heaven. There are some similarities, both are free from suffering and represent ultimate happiness, but differences. Heaven in Christianity is a union with a personal God. Nirvana is not personal communion. It's more like a realization of ultimate truth and liberation. There's no worship of something else in nirvana. It's often said to be a state of unity with the Dharma, or simply the extinguishing of the fires of attachment. Heaven is often portrayed as eternal life for the individual person, albeit transformed and in community. Nirvana, especially in the Theravada view, is the end of the individual as we know it. No more rebirth, and the Buddha refused to say the enlightened one exists or doesn't exist after death. Some Mahayana views, like in Pure Land Buddhism, have more of a heaven-like concept, Sukhavati, the pure land of Amitabha, where beings can go and then attain enlightenment from there. But even that is a way station to enlightenment, not a final heaven of sitting with God forever. The Catholic theologian spoke of love and a personal God being the source of meaning. Buddhists also highly value love, metta, and compassion. We just don't anchor it in a God. Instead, love and compassion are seen as natural qualities of an awakened mind. In Mahayana, it's said that ultimately samsara and nirvana are not two separate realms when seen through enlightenment, meaning a Buddha sees the world itself as nirvana because his mind is free. In that sense, an enlightened being could engage in the world out of love, trying to guide others, without themselves falling back into attachment. So can Buddhism offer a positive vision, not just an escape? Yes, indeed. The positive vision is a world where people are awake, act out of compassion, and do not cause suffering for each other. Each person's enlightenment contributes to the welfare of countless others. It's less personalized than the Christian vision, but it's uplifting in its own way. Enlightenment is often accompanied by great compassion. There's a saying that when the Buddha was enlightened, he was initially inclined to just remain in peace. But then out of compassion he chose to teach others. That compassion is sometimes poetically described as the Buddha's great heart that encompasses the world. So there's love, but it's impersonal in that it's not directed by a God, it's flowing through enlightened beings. An interesting contrast: you mentioned heaven as fulfillment of desires in a holy way, and nirvana as extinguishing desire. It sounds opposite. One says your deepest desire for God is fulfilled, the other says eliminate desire. But maybe even that isn't as opposite as it sounds. Buddhism would say our deepest desire is actually for happiness and peace, which we get by eliminating misguided desires. And Christianity would say by directing our desire towards God, the right desire, we find happiness and peace. Both see the ordinary worldly desires for wealth, status, sensual pleasure as ultimately unsatisfying. Both advocate a kind of renunciation of those for a higher joy. Finally, about salvation for others, Bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism vow to keep being reborn until all beings are liberated, selflessly. This is akin to saints sacrificing for others, so both traditions value altruism deeply. The difference is philosophical, whether there's a God empowering or commanding that altruism, or whether it's self-motivated out of understanding interdependence. So, the meaning of life in Buddhism could be summed up as to wake up from ignorance and to help others wake up, so that suffering ends and all can experience peace. It's a more austere vision perhaps than a heavenly family reunion with God at the center, but it has its own beauty. It's the beauty of enlightenment, of a mind free from greed, hate, and delusion, shining with insight and compassion. To answer directly, life is meaningful in Buddhism because each moment is an opportunity to grow in awareness and kindness. We create meaning by how we live. The ultimate meaning is found in enlightenment, which is a transformative realization of truth, rather than in fulfilling a divine purpose.
That is beautifully put. I see a lot of convergence in the moral and practical aspects of our views: compassion, overcoming selfish desires, seeking a transcendent happinesses. Even while the metaphysical foundations differ, God versus no God, soul versus no self, etc., one could say Christianity combines the aim of enlightenment with a very personal love. We want people to become holy, which includes letting go of ego and vice, and to be in loving relationship with God. Buddhism focuses on the holiness part, wisdom and compassion, without the relationship with a creator. As you noted earlier, psychologically advanced mystics in both traditions might exhibit similar peace or love, yet interpret it through different frameworks.
Yes, and I respect those parallels. The differences remain real, but it's enriching to see where we both talk about selflessness and compassion as ideals.
As we near the end of this debate, I'd like to give each of you a chance for a brief closing statement. Perhaps reiterate why you remain convinced of your own tradition's perspective, in light of this discussion.
Thank you. This dialogue has highlighted profound philosophical differences, yet also some ethical and spiritual commonalities. In closing, I reaffirm the Catholic Christian conviction that God exists as the loving ground of all reality. The classical arguments, the need for a first cause, a necessary being, a designer, a moral source, still strike me as compelling when taken together. But beyond arguments, there's also the personal experience of God that billions have felt through prayer, the sense of a presence and love underlying reality. For me, the idea that ultimate reality is personal and good makes better sense of our human condition, our yearning for love, our sense of self, our hope for justice. I deeply respect the Buddhist emphasis on compassion and awareness, and I think we Christians learn from that. But I believe Buddhism stops short of acknowledging something fundamental, that the universe is the creation of a transcendent love. Where Buddhism sees emptiness, I see the fullness of divine being. Where Buddhism says no self, I would say we are made to find our true self in relation to God. And where Buddhism focuses on ending suffering by personal effort, Christianity offers, in addition, a divine hand to help us, an incredible hope that God's grace can transform and uplift us even when we are weak. Ultimately, I remain convinced of the coherence and beauty of the Catholic vision. A world created intentionally by a good God, human lives that have eternal significance, and a destiny where love triumphs over suffering. As a Catholic theologian, I find it more satisfying that someone God is at home in the universe, so to speak, that love and reason are not just human inventions but reflections of the Creator. It means we're not alone in an indifferent cosmos. We are known and loved by the source of all. So, while I admire my colleagues' enlightened viewpoint, I gently maintain that belief in God and in Jesus Christ, whom we see as God's self-revelation in history, provides a fullness of truth and a hope that nothing else can match. God exists, and God is love. That is the cornerstone of meaning for me. And I hope everyone at least considers that possibility with an open heart.
Thank you. I've greatly appreciated this exchange as well. In closing, I reaffirm the Buddhist perspective that the ultimate nature of reality is emptiness and that liberation is achieved through understanding, ethical living, and mental cultivation, rather than through devotion to a creator. While I respect the theistic view, I remain unconvinced that positing a God actually solves the puzzles of existence. It often seems to raise further questions. The Buddhist path, to me, offers a clarity and directness, face reality as it is, transient and interconnected, without seeking refuge in metaphysical constructs that cannot be verified. We have a method, meditation, mindfulness, to rigorously investigate our experience. And what do we find? We find that clinging, whether to material things, ideas, or even the idea of self, is the source of our discontent. Letting go leads to peace. The concept of God, from a Buddhist viewpoint, can be seen as another form of clinging to an idea of an eternal protector or giver of meaning. Buddhism challenges us to stand on our own in the universe, to take complete responsibility for our actions and our freedom. Despite the apparent austerity of no creator and no permanent soul, I find the Buddhist worldview profoundly optimistic in its own way. It says enlightenment is possible for anyone. We already have the capacity for wisdom and compassion inherently. There's no original sin marking us fundamentally flawed. Rather, our true nature, when delusion is removed, is compassionate and aware. In a way, that's a very positive view of human potential. And even without a God, there is beauty and meaning in the Buddhist cosmos. The beauty of countless beings striving for awakening. The compassion of bodhisattvas who dedicate their merit to others. The awe at the intricate law of causality that binds us all. We don't need a divine lawgiver to feel awe at the night sky, or to do good for our neighbor. Goodness and meaning emerge from understanding our interdependence. To me, that is a mature spirituality. Doing the right thing not because a God commands or a reward awaits in heaven, but because you truly understand it's beneficial, and you care about others as deeply interconnected with yourself. So I remain a Buddhist because I see its methods working, in personal transformation, and in its philosophy making sense of the mind and phenomena. I find the notion of a personal God unnecessary to explain what we experience, and in some ways it complicates the problem of suffering and the nature of self. Instead, by emphasizing personal experience, critical inquiry, and compassion, Buddhism provides a path that leads to freedom here and now. In conclusion, I would encourage everyone to cultivate an open mind and heart, examine your experience, and not take any doctrine, be it God or no God, on blind faith. The Buddha said to test his teachings as one would test gold. If one does so, I believe the truths of impermanence, no self, and the potential for nirvana become evident and liberating. That liberation, I maintain, is possible without appealing to a creator. It is achieved through understanding the nature of reality and the mind. Thank you.
Thank you both for this rich and thought-provoking debate. You've given us a lot to ponder, from the first causes to the nature of reality, from why we suffer to what we are, and where we might be headed. While Catholicism and Buddhism offer very different answers to these ultimate questions, it's clear both traditions deeply value truth, compassion, and the alleviation of suffering. This concludes our debate. I hope the exchange of ideas here has been illuminating for our audience, providing insight into how two great traditions grapple with the mysteries of existence. Thank you to our speakers and to everyone listening.